Good morning, world. I'm Steve Rao, the host of Pod and Roku TV's World Edition. And I'm sorry for the lag in my Wi Fi. I'm probably going to have to log back in. But hopefully, you can hear me from wherever you are in the US or the world. And on this show, we talk about global affairs, innovation, a disruptive world politically, economically, as we continue to navigate in a post COVID world. Now, today, my monologue is based on the breaking news in the United States where, and I greet you live from the All America city of Morrisville, North Carolina. And North Carolina is the eighth largest state in the United States of America. Today, Donald Trump is rumored, is expected to be indicted for hush money, excuse me, that he paid uh, pornography star Stormy Daniels, I think her name is, um, hush money. Many witnesses have come forward, and there's been some suspicion of a protests around the country. So everyone is on standby for this breaking news. This will be the first time in the history of our country where someone indicted could possibly run again for the presidential nomination. So we'll be talking about that as well as how this could affect the presidential primaries for the Republican side, with Nikki Haley, the former governor and UN ambassador, who was in the Trump administration, along with Ron DeSantis as the two people who have formally announced that they are running for president. DeSantis is the governor of Florida and the heir apparent to the Trump revolution. Many people are now saying this may give him a better chance to claim the nomination. In addition, we have a special guest today on who's a military analyst. And before I bring him on, today is the day that Vladimir Putin is meeting Premier Xi from China. And I think this is a very scary and a game-changing event for United States of America, and also really makes us open our eyes about United States foreign policy. For many years in the post-World War II era, during the Cold War, and even after the Cold War, the United States foreign policy was really one that worked with our adversaries, but worked hard to make sure that our relationships with those adversaries were stronger than the relationships between those adversaries. For example, we had a cooling relations with Russia even after the Cold War, and after Perestroika and Gorbachev, a little bit more of a working relationship with them, even with Boris Yeltsin. Things changed a little bit in the recent years of Putin, but even in the early years of Putin's administration, things were actually relatively okay, as Russia was more focusing on democracy and being an ally of the West. With regards to China, dating back to Kissinger and Richard Nixon, you had détente with China. And even though we weren't the best friends with China, the relationships between the United States and China were better than between Russia and China. Today, my concern is that the foreign policy of a country has us somewhat isolated. We see our adversaries getting closer, in this case, Russia, China, and let's not forget the elephant in the room, North Korea. All of these countries have increasing nuclear power. And actually, when you think about it, there's more nuclear capability today against the United States with three countries developing nuclear weapons, along with Iran, than we ever had in the history of our nation. My final take is I think India is also the other conversation that needs to be had. The world's largest democracy, fifth largest economy in the world, and very soon to be fourth largest economy, is definitely making their play to be a superpower as well. I think it would behoove the White House and the administration to reach out to India and make not really an ultimatum, but say that it might be in their best strategic interests to have a stronger relationship with the United States. And India-United States relationship could play a critical role in countering the Russia, China, Korea. And let's not forget that India's military is actually one of the stronger militaries, much stronger than people give it credit for. Much, much, much stronger than Pakistan. We will talk about this in our analysis with Matthew Reed, our guest, and also get insight on other issues, including Ukraine, the economy, the banking crisis with Silicon Valley Bank, and now with Credit Suisse also announcing major layoffs as they merge with UBS. Let's get started. Today we have with us Matthew Reed. Matthew, we're going to welcome you to the show along with Mark Lee. I want to thank you for your service to our country and your insight, things I talked about, and also where we go from here. Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you, sir. Glad to have you here. And like I said, I was definitely honored to reach out to you and hear you being able to talk about a number of the issues that even Steve alluded to and everything. And I do know that you have definitely served in both the U.S. Marine Corps and the U.S. Army and served in both Iraq and Afghanistan, and actually had the privilege, as my understanding, of actually being able to recognize when there were double agents and those kind of folks that were doing the stuff in the U.S. And folks don't oftentimes think about the fact that we have spies even in our own country and all along those lines. Actually, I work at a grading company. You actually heard some of that in the background earlier and everything. And actually, one of our fellow readers, and I don't know if he's still with us, but he was actually a notorious spy that actually got convicted and arrested and all in that space, and then eventually got freed, and then is now in that company. And it's not like unknown knowledge, but yes, Felix Bloch, actually, as an older gentleman, I think he's in his 80s or 90s, if he's still around, it was actually very much involved in some of that early Russian spy kind of stuff. I want to say back in the 70s and all
Mhm.
along those lines. But I was just wondering your thoughts as to the state of the world. You kind of heard Steve mention it and everything, and definitely your notions of where we are and where we should be as a country and all along those lines, because definitely we do know that there are various military operations and we're seeing a lot of money being spent, including a lot of money being spent toward Ukraine, and some people are even wondering if that money could be used elsewhere and even help some of our issues here in the United States. But I definitely do believe in a strong military. But I was just wondering your take on where we are.
Sure. Uh, Try to give you my best summary without taking too much time. So, start with Russia and Ukraine. I'll start from there.
Yes.
So, people may say, okay, why is this happening? It, it ties in with history. It actually goes back a long way. So, first, for the last few hundred years, every existential threat and invasion the Russians have faced or had to fight off, going back to Napoleon, the German Wehrmacht, has usually come from the West and from Western Europe. Right. To put it in perspective, in World War II, the Russians lost over 27 million people fighting off the Wehrmacht and the Nazis. They actually lost more civilians to starvation at the Battle of Leningrad than all the servicemen we lost in World War II. And so that obviously scars someone. That's certainly going to play a role in influencing their thinking. And so for centuries, they've always believed, because they got a huge country and massive borders on the south, the west, and in their minds, they've always had to find some way to expand and secure those borders. Just because of the history and the way it works. I mean, going back to the Huns and the Mongols coming in through the south, Russian geography is both a blessing and a curse. It doesn't really become a blessing for them until someone invades the country and sets the first combat boot on Russian soil. Then they can work it against them. But until that happens, how do they secure it? Well, Peter Zion, I know, sums this up very good. They expand and secure choke points. It's why they occupied Eastern Europe, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, the Baltics after World War II. So we get to the end of the Second World War. They've occupied Eastern Europe, but they've more or less got the strategic depth that they wanted. So we come up with NATO as a way to kind of hem them in and contain them. And the way we did that was real simple. We used our Navy to patrol the world's sea lanes. And again, Peter Zeihan's analysis on this is probably better than mine. I'm using his, but he sums it up very well. We use our Navy to patrol the world's sea lanes so that the Europeans and the Japanese don't have to build empires. We do all the securing of import and exports for them. Piracy is a thing of the past thanks to the U.S. Navy. And they can import raw materials they need and export their finished goods without having to build much of a military. Okay, pretty simple. And of course, in exchange for that, they got to be on our side against the Soviets and the Russians. So it's pretty straightforward. So that's the system that's in place from 1947 on. Then we get to the end of the Cold War. The Soviet Union collapses. The Russians had a 60% drop in birth rate overnight, like that. And it was noticed by the Rand Corporation. And first we have that drop in birth rate, and then over about a decade and a half, what starts to happen? Millions of Russians die from drug overdoses, tuberculosis, HIV, their healthcare system collapses, alcoholism is rampant. And then millions and millions of, beautiful young Ukrainian and Belarusian girls are exported out overseas by the Russian mafia or order brides. Do this for about 15 years and run this out. What does that do to their population? Well, gets them to the point where the Russians are basically dying off as a people right now. And by the middle of this century, Russia will likely be nothing more than a Slavic old folks' home. What that means for us is when we get to probably the end of this decade, the Russians most likely will not be able to staff a military anywhere near as big as the one that they have now. That goes for their intelligence and security services. And again, you look at Peter Zeihan's website, Zeihan on Geopolitics, has some more specific summary. That's it in a nutshell. Okay? So when we get to the point where the Russians are dying off as a people, they don't have anywhere near enough young men to make up their intelligence services or their military. Here's $1 million question. This is separate from the war in the Ukraine. When the Russians are finally starting to die off, what happens to the thousands upon thousands of nuclear weapons they've got just sitting in storage or on their submarines or out in Siberia? Well, a whole lot of countries are going to probably try to grab at those things. And so how we contain that and stop that from happening, that's probably the single biggest strategic problem facing people who, in my former line of work as an intelligence analyst, that's one of the biggest problems we're facing now. Why are they doing this in the Ukraine? Pretty simple. If the Russians are going to do what they think they have to do to survive, which is expand and secure their borders, they have to do it before they run out of young men to staff an army, and that means they're on a time hack. So they're going hard at the Ukraine. Now, what's going to probably happen as a result of the war in the Ukraine, and where this is, this is where things get a little bit more insidious as far as how the Russian intelligence services are thinking, okay? Because they may be able to screw us real good in Europe and accomplish some of their strategic military objectives, whether they win the war or not. So what's happening? Ukraine is a massive exporter of wheat, grain, and fertilizer products, right? And the countries that are heavily, heavily dependent include a lot of Middle Eastern countries and much of Africa. Okay? As a result of this war, Ukraine's import-export terminals are mostly shut down. The one place where the Russians have been successful is at occupying those ports and smashing the living daylights out of them. So the export of those fertilizer, nitrates, wheat, and grain pretty much is coming to a halt, okay? Unless something changes. There's a lot that could happen in the next few years, but unless something changes, you're looking at mass starvation and famine in parts of Africa and the Middle East. So what does that do? Well, pretty simple. Starvation, probably going to have, second and third order effects of civil wars, ethnic unrest. And the last time we had something even remotely close to that, we had a mass wave of migrants coming in from Africa and the Middle East into Europe. And it was only a few 100,000 of them, I think. But what was the political result of that? The very hard right-wing parties in Europe, the National Front in France, populist parties like the Five Star in Italy, Golden Dawn in Greece, AFD in Germany, dramatic gains in parliament, such that the most powerful party in the French parliament right now is the National Front. Okay. Here's something a lot of people don't understand about those particular parties in Europe. I don't want to sound like I'm painting with too broad a brush here, but a lot of their members, France and Germany, the AFD in Germany, National Front in France, a lot of their members are pro-Russian. Some of them very public about the fact that they're avowedly pro-Russian. So if Ukraine's ability to export wheat, grain, and fertilizer is permanently smashed or smashed for a number of years, which the war is doing just that, those exports stop. You have a lot of famine in parts of Africa and the Middle East. This time, you're probably going to have millions upon millions of Arab and African migrants pouring into Europe. I know analysts like Peter Zeihan, and I think maybe George Friedman, think it'll be the largest inward migration since the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century AD. That's a lot of people. And practical problem immediately would be, okay, What kind of a strain does that put on the European health and financial system? A lot. Possibly some kind of insurgency they have to fight off. Let's assuming that nobody from ISIS sneaks in and decides to cause trouble, which some of them probably will. That causes mass chaos behind enemy lines in Europe. Okay, basic military strategy. If I'm the Russians and you're Europe, if I can push tens of millions of migrants into your borders and cause you all kind of financial problems, that makes it that much harder for you to come at me militarily. Very simple military strategy. I mean, pretty straightforward. Ruthless, but straightforward. So if they can pull that off, and we do have a bigger swing in support towards the European right, we could end up in a situation where, for example, in our primary logistics hub in Germany, which is kind of NATO's logistics hub, still is, where we're going to have a lot of German politicians that may be, again, I don't want to sound like I'm painting with a broad brush. This is not everybody. There are members of the European right that are pro-American in NATO, but there are a fair number that are pro-Russian. So that creates a major counterintelligence problem, particularly for people in my line of work, as I used to be a counterintelligence analyst. This is the problem on a scale we've never really had to deal with since we first occupied Germany in 1945. And so even if the Russians end up not being able to completely hold Ukraine, the mass chaos and damage they can do in Europe might make it impossible, or at least extremely difficult and problematic for us and our allies to wage any kind of sustained campaign against them in around Eastern Europe or Belarus if there's a direct military confrontation.
Hey, Matthew, along those same lines, I definitely want to bring in Dan Worthington as well. But one thing I was curious about, and I heard a report recently, it might have been on 60 Minutes. How, as a former military man, do you feel our present military is? Are we ready for any sustained action? Should we have to face sustained action? Because I've heard some people that are concerned about the state of our own military readiness, whether that be the Navy, the Marines, or the Army, or a number of others branches. But I was just wondering, in your opinion, how ready are we for conflict? Should conflict be engaged, and we have to actually be engaged in war? I mean, we did go to Afghanistan, and we're still in Afghanistan in a lot of ways, but I was just wondering, how prepared are we for engaged military conflict?
It depends on a number of factors. It depends on how we choose to do it. Can we sustain a proxy war against the Russians via the Ukrainians for a while? Yeah, probably. China, it's a little bit different. It's not as difficult as some people might think. China has massive vulnerabilities we could easily take advantage of. For example, China gets over 80% of their oil from Middle Eastern oil and gas coming out of the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz, right? We started protecting their oil and gas imports in that area in the 1970s when President Nixon brought them into the order to have them on our side against the Russians. A pretty smart thing to do at the time. And so China's entire economy is based on mass import of things like oil, gas, and iron ore, mass export of finished products, right? Well, almost everything they import, iron ore, oil, and gas, they get from other continents, 5, 6, 7,000 miles away in some cases, right? And they have, for the most part, a complete inability to secure those imports. We've been doing it for them for decades. And while China's Navy is pretty big, it's huge, the vast majority of their naval vessels are not nuclear. Ours are. Once they get out past 1,000 miles, most of their ships just run out of gas. Okay? And it's well over 5,000 miles from, say, the Persian Gulf to Beijing and Shanghai. So if we got into a war with China, all it would take is for basically the U.S. and Indian navies to just pretty much sink every single Chinese flag oil and gas tanker coming out of the Middle East and the Persian Gulf, and then blockade all their ships importing their other import materials like iron ore in, say, the Persian Gulf, Africa, or the Indian Ocean. You wouldn't need but a few destroyers and submarines, maybe a one-carrier battle group to do it. And you've basically cut one of their main arteries in their throat. And in addition to that, everything that China has to, not everything, most of what they have to import to make their stuff and survive goes through a place in the South China Sea called the Straits of Malacca. It's one of the world's biggest trade routes or most important trade routes, but it's actually narrow. And if you take away the ocean, okay, and just look at it as an infantryman would, like I would, it's nothing but ambush and choke points. So if you notice, the U.S. Marine Corps over the past few years has gotten rid of its tank and artillery units, and they're replacing them with, guess what, anti-ship missile units.
Hmm.
And they're breaking it up to where the Marine Corps can break up their battalion-level expeditionary units and drop platoons and companies along that island archipelago. And with those anti-ship missiles, they just sink and fire on every single Chinese vessel coming in and out. Okay, and we do that in conjunction with the Indians, the Australians, the Vietnamese, the Thais, the Indonesians, the Malaysians, Philippines, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan. You've pretty much got them in an MMA style blood choke while you've cut one of their arteries over by the. And the only way China gets out of that is to take their Navy and literally fight their way through what hems them in. They have to fight their way through Taiwan, Japan, part of the Philippines, South China Sea, Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam. Yeah, good luck doing that and having it be easy. It'd be pretty damn difficult. And all the while they're doing this, if we want to, we've cut off their oil and gas shipments coming out of the Persian Gulf. Now, that's not all they need for energy. They do have other options. They have some coal reserves and a little bit of stuff they can get from Russia, but it's not that much. And China's been suffering through massive energy shocks. It's not known to most Americans, but quite some years ago, large swaths of their rural population had even turned to cannibalism because they can't feed all their people.
Wow.
And the war in the Ukraine's, they import a lot of foodstuffs from around the world. The war in the Ukraine's put a major kink in that. It's one of the reasons why some elements of China's national security people below President Xi really wanted to tell President Xi to tell Putin, hey, don't do this thing in the Ukraine, man. We're having enough trouble feeding our people already. But the Chinese kind of have this tradition of shooting the messenger that goes back thousands of years. Nobody wants to bring the guy on the top bad news for the most part. And I want to say it was Peter Zion had an interesting story about this. I can't remember what it was. It was an interesting story of something that actually happened with President Xi. But China, we would.
So how does this affect? Let me ask you this: how does this affect what I talked about earlier? U.S. foreign policy. Even journalists like Fareed Zakaria have talked about how the U.S. foreign policy was always successful about making sure we're negotiating with our adversaries, but now we seem somewhat isolated, right? I mean, what advice would you have to whoever the president of the United States is now or in the future about, how do we do it? I mean, could there be a coup in Russia? Do we want to, help Russia get a government in there that's a little bit more willing to work with the West? And then we rebuild that relationship to sever the ties between Russia and China. Because right now it looks like we're headed towards strong relationships with Russia, China, and North Korea. And that's why I brought up India. I mean, because I think India is kind of the elephant in the room, actually, because they could be a game changer with their economic power, their military strength. But India, unfortunately, wants both sides of their cake and eat it too. They want to be sides with Pakistan. They want to be sides with Russia, China. They want to be sides with Russia. So don't you think it's better for the U.S. and India to be more tied together now?
Oh, sure. So the relationship that our intelligence services have with India, for the most part, has always been pretty good. We had a lot of good exchanges going with them back when I was in Afghanistan. Everything from countering terrorism to various types of smuggling and weapons trafficking. A good relationship with them would be key. One reason being, again, if we want to really put a chokehold on China and kind of create a multi-layered blockade, the Indian Navy would be some of the best guys to help us do that. And they certainly are pretty capable. And there are a lot of people in our Department of Defense that are trying to push President Biden and future presidents towards, improving that relationship with India. I suspect a lot of this is already going on behind the scenes just because, again, thinking strategically, you want to put the chokehold on China. Indian Navy could really, really help us out a whole heck of a lot. And I think our military planners are certainly aware of that. Now, as far as long-term effects on foreign policy, a lot of ways it could go. For example, you're talking about a military coup in Russia. That's not outside the question. These things have happened in Russia before. Some geopolitical analysts think that if there's enough strain put on the Russian system, it may break apart into different countries and fiefdoms, or the Russian national security state, which is guys like Alexander Bortnikov and the FSB, Nikolai Patrushev, who used to come out to the Balkans, where I used to work as an intel analyst, and stir the pot and just cause us a lot of heartburn. But
Matthew, along those same lines, I was just wondering because some people have been wondering about this, and it's a question that I know has come up on the network and just in general, meaning Pod TV. How much of a problem is internal terrorism, and how much are there spies that are floating around in our own country? Because I know that there are some folks that would argue, and I think Dan may be one of them, that there are both members of Black Lives Matter and the Proud Boys, and I did intentionally use people from both sides of the aisle, that are influenced by foreign forces and all in that space in some of the things that they are doing in our own country. But you worked in foreign affairs, and you definitely worked in the sense of finding double agents and people that were doing stuff in our government that was not for the benefit of our common citizens. So how much of that is an issue, whether it is known organizations or unknown organizations?
It depends. It could become more of an issue. So let me take a step back and try to give some context for this. So one thing that the Russian intelligence services became quite good at after the Communist Revolution was infiltrating a lot of European countries and creating what we call illegals networks. Some people call them sleeper agents. Some people try to use those terms interchangeably, but they were quite good at that. And in pre-World War II Europe, the Russians set something up they called the Red Orchestra. That was what German Abwehr counterintelligence and the German SS counterintelligence called it. In fact, that sleeper network, or that illegals network, was one of the reasons why Reinhard Heydrich, the SS counterintelligence head, was being, so inordinately ruthless in places like Prague and Czechoslovakia. He was trying to root that network out. The Germans knew it was there. And so what the Russians were good at doing is slipping these guys in over a very slow, long period of time. So most spies, for example, might go to work out of an embassy. You use diplomatic cover. Okay, let's say me and you go in, we're spies. We got different passports, different names, and what our real names are, and maybe we're listed as trade advisors to the ambassador. But our job is to go in slow and look for people who have access to information we want, recruit those people, get them to spy for us, steal things from their country, give it to us, so we can inform policymakers, so on and so forth. Okay, that's basic spying. An illegals network is something different. Let me give you an example of how the Russians might do this. So they might recruit people from, say, in the Cold War, East Germany, who could obviously speak perfect German, right? And they may send them through, say, Canada on a West German passport, okay, if their intelligence services have more or less forged, and we're quite good at. And they live a few years in Canada, working a normal job, normal thing, whatever, maybe even going to college. And then they get Canadian citizenship, then maybe they apply for U.S. citizenship and come down to work somewhere in Washington, in a media company, social media, Wall Street firm, whatever. It's a very long period of infiltration. It's got multiple layers of identity protection in it. It's extremely difficult to root those guys out. I mean, you'd almost have to grab a group of people and you think, okay, which ones are sleepers? And you'd have to have a really good counterintelligence investigation that would involve Canada, Germany, the U.S., to trace it all back and see where the gaps are. That can take a long time. And then that person works their way up in a Wall Street firm or maybe a K Street lobbying firm, and without any contact with their case officers in Russia. And then maybe after they've been there a number of years, they go out one day and they see a parked, say, Toyota Corolla, and there's a house plant in the rear window. That's a safety signal saying, hey, you're being activated. And then they go and they meet with whoever that case officer is, and he gives them their assignment. Now, if you can take enough of those types of people and slip them in, okay, we're usually on the lookout to protect organizations like the intel agencies, the DoD, the Department of Energy from that kind of penetration. But you don't have to just infiltrate those organizations if you want to cause chaos. Okay, so if instead of trying to infiltrate government agencies, the DoD, you infiltrate Wall Street, places affiliated with the Federal Reserve, social media companies, and you get in a position where you can manage and shift things around or help shift or support any kind of prevailing narrative, okay, whether it's from the left or the right, or look at something that maybe does happen and slant it, make it look worse than it is, or throw fuel on the fire, especially with social media. If you've got a good illegals network in place, oh my God, any case officer worth his salt can have a field day with that. Do I think those people are in place? Most likely, yes. Problem is, many of them may have already attained U.S. citizenship. And obviously, for constitutional reasons, we are very constrained on what we can do against U.S. citizens. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's fine. But going after these people and first trying to figure out, if you're looking at, say, a social media company, look at all the people doing what they do. And you know there's one or two Russian sleeper agents there, or illegals. Which one is it? If all you have is a little bit of information on each one, they're all U.S. citizens, how do you figure out which one it is? And the only way to do that would be to somehow put every one of those employees under 24-hour surveillance, which would be expensive and take a long time and take a lot of people, and not just amateur surveillance like sitting outside their house in a van, like they're not going to see that. If they're illegals, they've had some form of tradecraft training from some of the best in the business, the Russian KGB, SVR, GRU. And you've got to be able to do the type of surveillance that would catch them in the act meeting with someone who we know is a Russian case officer and is also pretty good at counter surveillance.
Hey, Mark, can we let Dan, what's your insight? I want Dan to engage with us here. And Matthew, thank you so much. We got Dan Worthington with us. Dan, can you share us what your thoughts are of what Matthew has said and kind of like where you stand on some of these issues?
I'm just enjoying listening to Matt discuss these issues. They are serious issues, yeah, and of a great concern. Russia's been at it a long time. I mean, they were fomenting everything in the 60s. Remember that, Matt?
Yes, sir.
The drug culture and free love and all that crap, anti-war movement. They spent hundreds of millions of dollars fomenting that. And so they're good at it. They're well practiced at it. Chinese are really good at it too, by the way. They use soft power to infiltrate, to spy on us, steal our trade secrets and technology and everything else. And so, but we do the same thing to them. So
that's true. Hey, Matthew, along those same lines and everything. Both parties have made accusations about Russian influence on the elections, and definitely we heard that definitely from Trump camp and from the Biden camp and different other kind of camps. How much of that is a concern of yours as a former special agent, that there are things like Dominion and others that could be manipulating some of their own elections and everything in that space? I just wondering how much of that is a concern to you.
It'd be from a counterintelligence perspective, it'd be a very serious concern. It's something that worried the heck out of me when we saw it happening to varying extents. And while, both the Republicans and the Democrats accuse each other of it, one thing I've learned about politics is when someone's accusing someone else of something, they're also usually doing it. And it happens.
And then they double down.
Yeah.
When they double down.
Usually, yeah, you're right.
You could always tell when they're guilty because they double down. Democrats are especially good at doubling down. They did it during the entire Trump thing. They were dirty as skunks, lying their asses off. Everyone knew it. Yet they continued to double down. It's so incredibly stupid. It's like this case in New York. Feds already decided not to go against Trump on this case. And so the city of New York decides to do it. they're going to get their butts handed to them. It's really interesting to see how Justice Department, other entities that have been weaponized politically. They should not be weaponized. It creates havoc. It's a bigger risk really to our rule of law and our values than even some of these counter espionage and other efforts that. Well, and I imagine that the Chinese are involved and the Russians are involved in creating this havoc because they like us splintered. They don't like us because when we are united as a people, they have no chance. If they can divide us within, then they just love that. And the Saudis are involved in this too. So let's not forget them because they really kind of hate us too. They've been funding jihad and all these crazies for a long time, and yet they'll be friendly in front of us, but stab our backs behind us.
Hey, Matthew, along those
9/11.
Matthew, along those same lines, even with the Saudis and everything, I know the other thing that you've been doing lately, and actually I have a cousin that served in the military as well. Unfortunately, one of the things I learned about the military is that you have a certain amount of times to advance, and if you don't make those advances, then they send you to the civilian force. So he's actually working in the civilian force and getting a lot of government contractors. I think he made it up to Lieutenant Colonel, my cousin Emmett Spurlock and everything. But I was just wondering your own thoughts about your work as a government contractor, and are you getting a lot of contracts that are in the Middle East? Because I do know that he did some work in the Middle East and Qatar and other places have been very active in needing that help, and they definitely have the money to pay for those kind of work as well. So I just wondered if you could speak a little bit about what you're doing currently, even in that government contracting space, since you have retired from the intelligence service.
So I probably will be going back to work in the intelligence community soon. There are still a fair number of contracts coming up, mostly in Iraq and Baghdad, where a lot of it seems, and Qatar. I should say in Qatar too. Nowhere near what they used to be. And it's starting to draw down more and more. Those jobs are getting fewer and fewer between. One reason is the United States doesn't have anywhere near as much reason to be involved in the Middle East because since 2019, we've been completely energy independent as a result of our shale oil and gas boom. But we got no use for anything coming out of the Middle East. I mean, China and, maybe potentially Europe, if they want to stop importing stuff from Russia, would have an interest there, but not necessarily us, which is a good thing, gives us some flexibility. We can actually flip the middle finger to the Saudis now, and who cares? But as far as what I see going on the contracting side, those jobs are still there, but they're concentrated in some very small areas. Now, based on what I'm seeing on the contracting side, it seems we're still pretty active and plan to be active maybe for the very near future around Iraq and Baghdad. Now, how long they plan to keep those assets in place is anyone's best guess. I mean, when I was working as a counterintelligence analyst in Kosovo, and we did a massive withdrawal from Afghanistan in August of 2021. Right up until that suicide bombing that killed those soldiers, sailors, and Marines, right up until that happened, there were still contract jobs being advertised in Afghanistan as the withdrawal was happening. And I'm going, yo, man, you guys not watch the news? But just that it may indicate we stay there a little bit longer, but we could be out of there next year. Who knows? But I do get the sense that it is steadily decreasing and winding down quite a bit.
No, that makes sense. What do you see as the next hot spots? We know that the war in Ukraine is a very big one. We know that there are activities in certain African nations and everything. We hear about the peace, talking about that a little bit yesterday, even though some of the folks on the panel felt that the PLO was the only one that was being the terrorists. I actually think that there might be some terrorists on the Israeli side as well, but that's just my own personal opinions. But what do you see as the next?
That's your bias. That's your bias.
Well, there's a few places I would look for. I would continue to watch the Ukraine space. You never know, the Russians may decide to pull out there and hit somewhere else. They've done things like that in their past. Other places I would watch the Persian Gulf, because for a number of years now, you've had an Arab-Israeli alliance that's kind of slowly been brewing behind the scenes. It's been going on for a long time. It hasn't been talked about until fairly recently. But long story short, the Emiratis and the Israelis, because they can put two and two together, when they saw America becoming completely energy independent, they knew what that meant. That meant a dramatically reduced U.S. presence in the Middle East, because why the hell spend all that, life treasure, blood treasure, and money for something you don't need? They thought, okay, what does this mean for us? So who's the big demon in the room for both the Israelis and the Arabs? That's the Persians of Iran. The old Persian Empire is something they feared going back. Going back to the era of Parthian Rome, when the Parthians got smashed again and the Persians came back. It goes back a long way. So you take Israeli intelligence and military know-how and Israeli military technology, which is really impressive, and then you merge that with, say, Arab oil money from the Saudis, the Qataris, and the Emiratis. Boy, can that accomplish a lot. And there's no sign that alliance is ebbing and flowing in spite of what China is trying to do. What China is trying to do is work diplomatically to keep the Middle East calm, because if the Arab-Israeli alliance and the Iranians start shooting at each other, China's oil and gas lifeblood literally gets caught in the crossfire. And it's just the Chinese are not stupid. They can see that. So they're trying to head that off. Now, key question is, will they be successful?
Do you think China will invade Taiwan?
A long time ago, I might have said it was unlikely, but given all the internal problems China's having now, and the fact that Xi is like one of their most ethno-nationalist leaders they've had in their history, one of the things that Chi-Com Party and the CCP has to do is find some way to keep their population subdued or fat, dumb, and happy, and they're losing the ability to do that. A propaganda victory in their mind would be a good thing. Now, let's say they do invade Taiwan, okay? Let's just say they invade Taiwan and they start blowing things up. Here's a question. Given how advanced Taiwan is technologically, can anyone be certain that the Taiwanese don't have their own cache of nuclear weapons stashed somewhere? And if they're facing being destroyed, will they hesitate to use them? Probably not. Now, let's say the Taiwanese don't have any nukes, okay? If the Chinese invade Taiwan, the second the first Chinese Army combat boot hits their soil, you can bet the South Koreans and definitely the Japanese are going to start building their own nuclear weapons, and the Japanese will point them right at Beijing. And if the Japanese wanted to, they could probably build a small nuclear arsenal in like a week or so. They can do it very quickly if they need to, and I can promise you, for a number of years now, their military, whether or not they've done it yet or not, they are definitely thinking it. Now, China's intelligence analysts, there got to be some there that are reasonably bright, should be thinking about this. Okay, it tells you, okay, boss, we take Taiwan, great, we got the victory. Okay, it'll last a little while. Okay, but assuming the Taiwanese don't pop off nukes on our forces when they're hitting their beaches, which they have nukes, that's probably what they'll do. What about if the Japanese decide they have to build their own nuclear arsenal and the Americans can't necessarily restrain them anymore? Okay, what does that do? Now, again, a fundamental problem that Peter Zeihan has brought up, and on the intel side, I've seen a lot that would support what Peter Zeihan says as being accurate. The Chinese really don't like to bring bad things to their leader. He's got himself surrounded by yes men, which actually might make him a little bit more dangerous, because that means no one's telling him, hey, boss, time out. You got to think about this a little bit differently. You got to consider, the second and third order effects of doing A, B, and C.
Yeah, they're not
So,
thinking about that. Hey,
yeah,
Matthew, along those same lines, are we ignoring, meaning the West, a major continent? Because I know a lot of people are paying attention, and you alluded to it earlier that the Chinese and even the Russians are pretty much dictating a lot of what is going on in Africa, from the Middle East down to South Africa and everything. So, is that something that we as a Western nation are ignoring and should not be ignoring? Because that's a whole lot of people in the African continent, and there are some resources there as well.
well, it's definitely something I can tell you. I can tell you the DoD and the intelligence communities are actually paying a whole lot of attention to it. A lot of it's more clandestine behind the scenes, but we do watch that continent like a hawk. We have assets all over the place. The Russians and the Chinese are not pulling the wool over our eyes. We believe me, we know pretty much everything they're doing now. In terms of China's ability to influence things in Africa, it may vary from country to country. One thing that has started to happen in Africa, the leaders that are being elected are no longer the crazy communist types that came in there in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. The Africans realized that that was not a way to run your economy. And since they're, not stupid, they're actually pretty smart in terms of the changes they're starting to make. They decide to move a different direction. Now, China's trying to take advantage of that by doing things like giving them low interest but probably predatory loans. And they've had some success in maybe really, really poor places like Somalia.
Mhm.
However, a lot of countries in Africa, old Zimbabwe, which used to be Rhodesia, South Africa to a certain extent, a lot of the politicians that are coming to power in their parliaments are more nationalists, and a whole lot of them are winning on slamming the hell out of the Chinese as not being their friend, not being trustworthy. And the African politicians are not stupid. They can see what the Chinese are up to. And now that could go a lot of different ways. But if the Chinese got into a really, really bad spot and they wanted to make sure they could get all those resources, okay, one, they've got to be able to move in a military ground force and project enough power to do it. And if most of their Navy vessels are not nuclear powered, I mean, it's going to be hard for them to do it. Now, did the Chinese know that's an issue? They're trying to build more nuclear powered vessels. They may fix that decades down the road, assuming they last. If their oil and gas coming out of the Persian Gulf was cut off either by us and the Indian Navy or by a war between the Persians and the Arab-Israeli alliance, the strain that would put on them could be catastrophic. Would they be able to weather that? That's an open question.
Yeah. Hey, Matthew, and we're getting ready to wind down, and I know Steve got a closeout. I've actually got two quick questions for you. One is a serious question, the other is a more humorous one and everything. But the serious question is, in terms of education, do you feel that we are doing a good enough job of teaching our kids about geography and world affairs and the things along those lines? You work in intelligence, you definitely got to learn a lot of the geopolitical things that are going on in the world. And I don't know if you have any kids of your own, but I do know that there are education places that are on strike. I understand, and maybe that's something we'll talk about on the news tomorrow and everything, that there's an education strike in Los Angeles with some of their lesser known, with some of the support staff, not necessarily the teachers, but some of the support staff. But I was just wondering, what is your thoughts about the state of education, in particular the state of education on world affairs?
When it comes to teaching geography, world affairs, and I would add history into that, our school system is absolutely horrible and atrocious to the point of being an absolute embarrassment. I mean, we got kids graduating high school, in some cases graduating college, that can't find Ukraine on a map. It just boggles my mind. I mean, and our lack of teaching geography and history, the way the Iraq War went for us is a classic example. Okay, here's how I used to illustrate that. So we're not the first country to invade that area, invade Mesopotamia. Okay, some countries have had successful military expeditions, most notably the Roman Empire under Trajan when he smashed the Parthian power structure. But what he did was real simple. Clear objective, went in hard and fast, used his legions to fight almost in a guerrilla warfare style against the Parthians while he sailed his main military force down the Tigris and Euphrates River, smashed their capital, and then he turned around and got the hell out. Why? Well, that region has had a tradition of hit and run guerrilla warfare going back thousands of years. The word parting shot comes from the word Parthian shaft, because the Parthians had these long-range shaft-like spears they would use in hit-and-run attacks against the Romans that could sometimes inflict pretty heavy casualties on them. Constant problem for the Romans anytime they dealt with them. So, especially in the Anbar region of Iraq, there's a tradition of guerrilla warfare going back thousands of years. And then we go in and occupy Iraq, and when we start having problems in, of all places, Al-Anbar, Ramadi, Fallujah, our DOD guys and our generals act surprised, and I'm like, do you guys not read your history? I'm pretty sure the only general who wasn't surprised was Jim Mattis, and that's because he's such a man of history. And so our leaders, the Bush administration, Rumsfeld, it was obvious to anyone watching, they did not have a clue what they were really doing in terms of how they executed that mission. And had they studied the history of Alexander the Great, the Romans, they would have definitely not made near as many mistakes. So teaching geography, world affairs, and history in most of our educational institutions, it's so horrible that I cannot imagine it having anything but a horrifying effect on our future. Because those people, that uninformed, they all get to vote. And in many cases, the politicians they elect will be a reflection of them. And in the long run, there's no way that turns out good.
No, definitely. I did promise you that I was going to ask you because I do know that it's one of your hobbies and everything. And I have a friend that is in that same space. They actually told me that I needed one of those plans for my own escape should something happen in this world and everything. So I did promise you that I was going to ask you a teasing question. So I'm going to ask it right now, because I understand that you are also a person that is very serious about all of these issues, but you also have fun as well. And you are prepared for the zombie apocalypse. So and I've got a friend who told me that I need an escape plan and that the zombies are coming and all in that space. So what is a plan for a zombie apocalypse? And am I in deep trouble? Because if they come in that door, I don't know that I could run that fast. And there's no way to get out if they come through that door.
Well, you don't have to necessarily run faster than the zombies. You just have to run faster than anybody else they're after. There's one way to look at it. But, I mean, as far as an escape plan, depends on where you live. If you're going to escape someplace, you want to have a bolt hole, medical supplies, food supplies, definitely lots of clean water, a more rural area, someplace that's isolated, but someplace that maybe only has one or two ways in or out, someplace that is defensible. And in some places on high land where you can set up an observation point to look around. That's going to give you your best chance of survival. And of course, if it's zombies, you're going to want some semi-automatic firepower that you can shoot reasonably accurately. Because I think you have to shoot zombies in the head, so you don't want to miss.
Brains.
Yeah, if only I think somehow make a death rate, that'd be even better. But you want something along those lines. If you can set something like that up, your chances of survival increase dramatically.
Makes sense and everything. Right. Tell folks how they can reach you, and then I'm going to turn it over to Steve for the closeout and everything. But how can they reach you? And I do understand you have some books out as well. So
yes.
You want to tell folks about the books as well.
Sure. So best way to reach me is at my email, hybridnovelist@yahoo.com, or just look it up on my Amazon author page. Series of books that I write. Here's one. Okay. And nice little cover. That's In the Death of Night 2.0. That's about a retired CIA case officer who manipulates a Russian mafia syndicate in Houston and then slaughtering and killing terrorists and spies from Iran, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Al-Qaeda. It was something similar to what we did in World War II to the German and Italian intelligence networks. And
Mark, if you could send me his email. you could send me his email in my
We'll definitely
email,
do that.
that'd be great.
That's a
Yes. Well, we're
that's a
going to go
short
ahead and get ready for closeout.
Yeah,
I've got to
the
leave.
Jackals of Babylon. Just tell me about that really quickly as well.
It's a short story collection about mercenaries and assassins. One story is about the Enron executives being whacked and ambushed by mercenaries hired by their former shareholders.
Wonderful.
Well, I appreciate you being on, Matthew, and look forward to hopefully getting you back on some future shows as well. But you are a tremendous guest. Glad that I was able to find you, and hope that you'll make a return trip. I see that Dan even liked you as well. See, Dan, I can't go fast to folks that are more on the conservative side. You thought I only found liberal guests.
Yeah, I mean, you did a good job, Mark. You shouldn't have
Well,
mentioned the
we want to thank you,
Palestinians,
Matthew. And as I begin my
great.
closeout, we didn't get to talk about the Donald Trump situation, but nothing's really been decided yet. So there might be news tomorrow. We could talk about that, how it impacts the elections. We'll update everyone on the war in Ukraine with Sasha Starr returns tomorrow, and continue our discussion on, just the foreign policy of the U.S., what's going on globally. And the elephant in the room is obviously the Silicon Valley Bank crisis. And will this become another crisis? Credit Suisse is now in danger, and many entrepreneurs are facing liquidity problems, worried about have they bankrupt Silicon Valley Bank. So we'll talk about that tomorrow. My closeout is yesterday I had the honor of being with Chancellor Randy Woods at NC State for a very special event welcoming Charlie Baker, who's the current president of the NCAA, but the former governor of Massachusetts, to sign and talk about his book, Results, Getting Beyond Politics and Getting the Work Done. This book was really written by him and his chief of staff, Steve Kadish, a Democrat. And the story is actually how Governor Charlie Baker went on to become one of the more popular governors in Massachusetts history, winning his first election with a very narrow margin, but then winning his second election with very high margins. And how this Republican problem solver worked with his Democratic chief of staff to come up with one of the most successful gubernatorial administrations in state history. His advice to young NC students is public service can still be noble if you're in it for the right reasons. I was quite impressed with Governor Baker, his intelligence, his knowledge of the issues, his get it job done style, and the fact that he pulled all Massachusetts citizens together, residents together, not so much focusing on party and partisanship. In his closing remarks, Governor Baker said that he believes most of America is in the middle and that the parties are really marketing this game that America is on one side to the left or one side to the extreme right. Hopefully, Governor Baker is right, but I really enjoyed his talk. We'll be talking about his book tomorrow in my opening monologue, which I'll be reading tonight, and hopefully we can reach out to the governor to come on our show. He is in his first month as the president of the NCAA, and he wants to bring his results-oriented strategy and many of the principles in his book to now taking over an organization that's been somewhat unstable and in turmoil itself. Only time will tell whether the governor will have success, but impressive man. Surprised that he hasn't been mentioned as a presidential candidate, but even some Democrats said they wouldn't mind to see his name in the mix. That's what they said last night. And maybe he could be in an administration or on a ticket. Who knows? Massachusetts has been a very big political state. And to have a Democratic governor so popular going out after a second term really makes me wonder whether he may have the political skills to bring our country together. Yes, even as a Republican, but I think we need more Republicans like Charlie Baker right there at the head of the Republican Party. So with that being said, looking forward to seeing you all tomorrow for another edition of Pod and Roku TV's World Edition. From our family to yours, be safe. Look forward to talking to you soon. Thank you.